Number 10, the chimpanzee human, also referred to as humanzees, which is fun to say. Look, here are the facts, people. We were very close to chimpanzees, DNA-wise. Around 98% of our DNA is shared with these hairy fellows. Back in the 1920s, we got closer than ever. A humanzee was not just a fantasy. Soviet biologist Ilya Ivanov inseminated female chimps with human DNA, but it didn't work. Or did it? Things got questionable when a chimp named Oliver hit the scene in the 70s. Yeah, he was walking like a human, which we've never really seen before. He was referred to as the missing link because of his appearance and the way you would act. He was previously a performance animal. He was a show chimp, so not a hybrid, but many viewed these experiments as immoral back in the day. Which is, yeah, I agree. Also, I remember seeing chimps in family movies, I'm pretty sure. Remember those movies growing up where chimpanzees were like snowboarding or playing hockey? Most Extreme Primate, that was it. That's where we're at, chimpanzees doing barrel rolls and hockey stops. My friends, we're already there. I think we're already at the Planet of the Apes terrifying point. We're screwed if one of these experiments works, that's all I'm saying. Number 9, human cow eggs. Okay, we had a few giggles talking about chimps. Time to get into the real scary science. Back in 2008, hybrid research was being done. Human-animal hybrid research, obviously. The whole idea was to find a cure for Parkinson's disease. I like these projects because we're moving forward, at least. We're not just doing it because we're like, let's see if we can bring dinosaurs back. We're trying to find a solution. Otherwise, we don't need to be poking around cows. Nobody needs 3 bowls of cereal before gym class, okay? There's other ways to wake up in the morning. Let's just leave cows alone for like a bit, maybe? Scientists used the nucleus of a cow egg. They took it out and replaced that nucleus with the human and skin cells. And then in a little time, the egg can develop and turn into a blastocyst, aka a cloned embryo. And there we have stem cells for said science. Again, this is a lovely step, but how far do we go here with DNA mixing? How much DNA are we gonna mix before we're like, stop? Things could go south. For example, just like the number 8, Kunga. Perhaps the earliest example of human-animal hybrid testing. Scientists recently learned about this donkey hybrid that roamed ancient Mesopotamia. This was a time even before horses arrived, so they had to do something. Large Kungas would pull wagons, and smaller ones would help pulling plows and smaller loads. These little guys were the talk of the town. Imagine a hybrid animal before horses. No wonder they were a status symbol back then. 4,000 years ago, they were given as gifts for weddings. Nice, yummy. Oh, I wonder what this one is. It's definitely a Kunga. It's gotta be a Kunga. After so long, scientists are finally able to figure out what exactly a Kunga was a hybrid of. It was a female donkey and a male Syrian wild ass. Yeah, it's crazy what you can still learn from ancient animal bones from thousands of years ago. Science is incredible. It was more amazing how involved this hybrid was in Mesopotamian culture. Do we bring back the Kunga? I don't know. Kind of seems like we could use them. Number 7, woolly mammoth. It was announced less than a year ago that a team of scientists and entrepreneurs over at a new biosciences and genetics company called Colossal, they got the funding finally for quite this project. They're planning to bring the woolly mammoth back to life. Yep. Instead of just paying off student loans, they're like, how about we bring a mammoth back? Let's just see if we can do that. That'll solve some problems. The last mammoth alive was around 7,500 years ago. But what if we had these hairy Goliaths back again today? The Siberian tundra, thousands of years ago, was once full of these guys, but climate change began to slow them down. Also, humans needing food definitely didn't help. These guys provided warmth and, well, obviously look at them. Lots of food, so they died off quite quick. Genetics company Colossal raised over $15 million to try and bring this thing back to life. And they're on the way, they're doing it right now. That's happening as we speak. A mammoth is being born. They're using the CRISPR gene editing tool, which is a fun tool, I guess. Elephants are still kicking around and their genomes, combined with the preserved mammoth DNA, is the magic trick. So if you see mammoths trending on Twitter in 4 to 6 years, well, you know why. There's not another Ice Age movie. It's definitely just a real mammoth. Number 6, Pyrenean ibex. The Pyrenean ibex also went extinct a long time ago. This was much sooner though than mammoths. This was around 2000. The last one was a female named Celia, and a falling tree sadly ended her life. Of all the ways to go, really? Come on, man, that's sad. It was a subspecies of the Spanish ibex. They were native to the Pyrenees Mountains on the border of Spain and France. Back in the medieval ages, their population was reduced drastically to an endangered level because of, knights and swords and bows equals lunch, right? So the numbers dipped, more than fair, there's armies to feed. But in 2009, science was ready for the Pyrenean ibex to return. It was successfully cloned and brought back from extinction for 7 whole minutes. Yeah, 7 minutes in heaven, or 7 minutes out of heaven, rather. DNA from the last living lady was implanted in the womb of a domestic goat. Yeah, a little goat hybrid. Lung complications are why the clone sadly didn't last, but we had a hybrid medieval animal for 7 minutes. We're getting close. Number 5, the super cow. Moo, but with a lot of O's. Introducing the super cow. Okay, start your day off with some super milk, and then have a super stomach ache. your super pants. My God, I can't do milk anymore. Only in Belgium. Back in the 1800s, scientists and farmers brought together native cattle and short horn cattle to make this hybrid animal. After that, they would literally just pick the biggest cows of the bunch and then have them breed together, and then so on and so forth. These cows are officially called Belgian Blues, but I will continue to call them super cows. Thank you very much, because that sounds amazing. I can't even look at them. God, they're disturbing. They look like bodybuilders. Just, it makes no sense. What? Where does that come from? Let's move on. Number 4. Tasmanian tiger. Once native to Australia, the Tasmanian tiger, also known as the thylacine, was a massive carnivorous marsupial that went extinct around the 1930s, also quite recently. Major factors here are, as you guessed what I said earlier, climate change, hunting, and its genetic diversity wasn't all too great. All those combined, it's just no chance. It's sad on one hand because these beautiful creatures disappeared so recently, but it's also recent enough that we have a shot at bringing them back to life. Hey, what's up? Hey, you've been asleep. Bye. Hybrid science. There we go. Let's get mixing. Yeah, imagine looking outside and seeing this thing on your front yard. Are we ready for this? I think we're ready. Let's jazz up some trails by introducing these guys. Specimens of the Tasmanian tiger still remain preserved in jars. No idea who has them or why, but we'll move on from that. Thank God for those jars. So we have Tasmanian tiger genes present, so scientists can now insert them into a mouse fetus. They just combine fetus of a mouse and DNA. I do this a lot. This is how I'm gonna explain this to my kids and be like, hey, this is how the human life cycle works. You just do this with your hands a lot, and then you're alive. They're still lacking the full DNA to successfully recreate it, but they're close. A recent $5 million donation to the University of Melbourne earlier this year allowed for researchers to create a research lab. So yeah, they're actually getting very close. They're like making the lab to make this thing. I'm like, ooh, they're gonna do it. Number 3, the great razor auk. Yes, once thriving in colonies off North Atlantic coasts, the great auk would grow up to 30 inches long and its wings would only be used to swim. They were cute, but quite defenseless, these little guys. Around the 1500s, European fishermen discovered this perfect area for hunting and or eating, and it just happened to be where most of these great auks were hanging out. So they disappeared fast. By 1950, the last 2 known specimens were hunted by a single fisherman on Eldey Island, just off the coast of Iceland. And that was it. They were gone. Until now. Nice. Scientists plan on using genetic information extracted from their fossils, or preserved organs. Remember those guys in jars and the organs that I talked about? Yep. Classic organs in jars. Always coming in handy. They plan on editing their DNA into the closest living species, which is now the razor-billed auk. So now we get a nice fun hybrid again. The organization Revive and Restore is behind the wheel on this one, so keep it up. Keep bringing things back from extinction. Just not humans. I don't want zombies, please. Number 2, lions. Back in the 80s in the Chatbir Zoo in India, they started an experimental program where they would breed together domestic lions and African lions in the hopes that they would just be introduced to the wild and help with the dwindling population of wild lions in India. On paper, that's a great idea. That's a step forward. We love those. But the zoo found 2 African lions that were being used in a circus and was like, you know what? We're gonna save you guys. Get out of the circus. Then they brought them in to breed with their 2 Asiatic lions. So I mean, from circus to science, it's like, you're still sorry. When the cubs were born, it was clear this was already a mistake from the get-go. The cubs already had severely weak back legs, they were having trouble walking as they got older, their immune system started to fail, and by 2000 they had bred more than 70 of these hybrid lions. So they finally decided to stop the program and all the males were given vasectomies in order to stop any further reproduction. There are luckily laws that prohibited them from killing these animals, so at this point we're just waiting for them to die naturally, which sucks, but it's definitely better. And finally, number 1, the dodo bird. Dodo birds were once big and beautiful. These flightless ground nesting birds once filled the islands of Mauritius located in the Indian Ocean. They were awesome. We've seen them in Ice Age. They're all funny and big and furry. They had massive talons. They were gray and blue. They were gorgeous, and best part of all, they didn't have any natural predator until, us. Until we came around. Around 1507, the island was discovered by Portuguese sailors, and well, the rest is history and or lunch. They were the easiest bird to hunt, hence the phrase dead as a dodo. They weren't just loved by sailors either, they were not 100% to blame here. Monkeys, rats, pigs, any animal basically that made its way to the island easily had their eggs for lunch, so it didn't take long for the dodo bird population to be completely wiped out. The last dodo was hunted in 1681, but could it be? Could we bring back said dodo birds? Scientists found an extremely well-preserved dodo skeleton back in 2007, so we may have a chance at picking some DNA apart there and bringing them back to life via hybrid science. A research facility near Melbourne, Australia is currently trying to use pigeon genes to bring the bird back. I mean, yeah, I'm all for the idea of bringing an animal back to life. Scientifically, that's definitely a feat in itself, but how long before these things are on hot ones, like dodo chicken wings? Now that I've said it, you kind of want one, right? Kicking off the list at number 10, the aviator suit. When it comes to new ideas and new inventions, it almost seems messy at first, all the time. It's always a horrible start. And today's list is quite messy, a lot of horrible experiments done with groups of unaware subjects. To kick this grim one off, we'll look back to the early 1900s. We'll start with Franz Reichelt, a known inventor of the time. He invented his own version of a wearable aviator suit. It was a parachute. It was made of 320 square feet of fabric. It wasn't light at all. And in 1912, Franz wanted to test this new invention out in public, but instead of using a dummy and throwing that off the Eiffel Tower, Franz wanted to be brave and he strapped himself in. And the rest is history. Dark, horrible fast history. Number 9. The Hoffling Hospital Experiment. This experiment happened all the way back in 1966, so a bit more recent, in a time where the rules of psychological experiments, well, didn't really exist. Really. I was gonna say they were kind of loose, but no, they were not really a thing at all. Because of this, the nurses that were all part of this experiment had no idea that they were participants, which nowadays is totally illegal, very illegal. The night nurse would receive a phone call during the shift, and on the other end would be Dr. Smith, who's actually the researcher in this scenario. He would ask the nurses to check the medical cabinet to see if they had a drug called astrotin, which was actually a drug that was made up for this experiment, and it was actually just a placebo, so don't worry too much. The astrogen would clearly state the maximum dosage of 10 milligrams, but Dr. Smith would ask the nurses to administer 20 milligrams. They were told that the doctor was in a hurry and he would sign the papers later and all that jazz. This just had to get done that night. This had to be delivered to the patient ASAP. If the nurse decided to give the patient the drug, they would be breaking 3 rules. They're not allowed to accept instructions over the phone, the dose was double the maximum limit stated on the box, and the medicine itself was unauthorized. Big 2. And it was not on the ward stock list, so it shouldn't be used in the hospital in the first place. Big 3 red flags right there. Out of the 22 unknowing nurse participants, 21 of them went to administer this. Yeah, big oof on that one. Yikes. To be fair, that's the entire point of this test. This is nothing towards the nurses. I'm not ripping on them at all. I mean, this was 1966. We didn't know quite a bit back in the day, you know what I mean? This really showed the pressure nurses are put under randomly in the middle of the night, if anything. Number 8, UCLA schizophrenia experiment. Starting in 1983, UCLA researchers Michael Gitlin and Keith Neutraline went to great and pretty unethical lengths just to see how people who are suffering from schizophrenia relapse. Yeah, basically they're trying to figure out if there was a way to predict the relapse, or a psychosis episode of some sorts. Now, sounds like a good idea on paper, I guess, but the way you go about things, historically, come on, we could have done a lot better. Unfortunately, this experiment involved recruiting hundreds of participants who were all being treated for schizophrenia at the time, and then just taking them off their meds completely. Yeah, as I said that, you at home probably went, ooh, yeah, that's exactly right. What a horrible idea. Like, we're going the opposite way here. We're not supposed to do this, right? There's no suitable plan in order for when they could return to their medication. And they also didn't do a good job making sure these patients were actually safe during these experiments. They're like, yeah, let's just take people off their meds, see what happens. It's horrible. It's one of the worst. Unfortunately, the results were as bad as you thought and proved to be fatal when one of the participants, Antonio Lamadrid, ended up taking his own life. Again, not sure what we expected here in this sense. An article from 1994 also said the doctors failed to get proper consent from the patients as well. Just a cherry on top of this horrible experiment. Just when you thought it couldn't get worse. There you go. Number 7, psychic driving. British psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron is to blame for this one. Remember that name. Don't listen to anything he says. He created the psychic driving concept that the CIA found interesting, to say the least. Basically, psychic driving was a procedure that subjects patients to a continuous, repeated audio loop of something that's intended to change their behavior. Just the same line or the same whatever over and over thousands of times. And through the course of their treatment, they would also be paralyzed while being exposed to the loop message. Yeah, the worst thing ever, right? So the CIA heard about this and started sending money to fund Cameron's experiments, but he actually didn't know it was coming from the CIA because they used a fake name. Classic CIA. Cameron would subject patients to paralytics and electroconvulsive therapy, stronger than usual as well, just to make things worse, just at a horrible limit. The experiments were mostly conducted on patients who entered the institute for more common problems like anxiety disorders or postpartum depression, and they ended up leaving with permanent effects from his actions. These included things like amnesia, being unable to speak. Some people forgot their parents' names and thought that the interrogators were actually their real parents. Just horrible things. Their minds were just so confused. Brutal stuff. Number 6, go pills. Here in Toronto, we have go trains, go buses, but not go pills. Not yet. Hopefully not ever, actually. Yeah, move over 5-hour energy. We got some competition on the horizon. Staying awake is challenging. Even when you're doing something you absolutely enjoy, like watching a movie, you'll still fall asleep. It just happens, we're human. My dad fell asleep in a theater once in the moving chairs. I couldn't believe it. Guy's 3D glasses were falling off of his face. I was in shock. But he works a lot. He works crazy hours, he's older. That's where Go pills were supposed to come in handy. Workers who have these long shifts and work late hours to pay the bills. This pill was supposed to keep you up for 40 hours straight. So a bit much, I'd say. The US Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, or DARPA, which is much less air coming out of my mouth, is currently funding this pill. But what if it's mistreated? I can't even begin to imagine the negative effects something like this could have on people. We could barely handle Tide Pods as a community. You know what I mean? It's kind of a bad idea, I vote. Number 5. The Milgram experiment. When learning about our past in further detail, like the Trinity test for example, and how that led to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's important to understand why these things happened and why these people did this, or more so how people are influenced into doing these horrible things historically, especially in large numbers. So the Milgram experiment was put in place to get an idea. How far will people go when it comes to obeying instructions, specifically if it involves a third party being hurt? Well, Stanley Milgram, Yale psychologist, created this test. There's 3 important roles for this one. You need the teacher, the experimenter, and the learner. The learner is disguised as the main test subject, but really, they're actually in on the whole thing. The real subject is over here. The teacher, the one administering pain to the test subjects. So they're told by this higher figure, whoever, to keep upping the pain every time they get a question wrong. They're like the rule maker. So the real test here is to see how far humans will go when hurting others under direct authority. It's important to note that the subject also isn't actually getting shocked at all. Again, they're in on it. They play it up. They play it up more and more just to see what's going on. These tests were underway in 1961 in a basement at Yale University. In college, I did improv. That's wild. That's a wild after-school curricular activity. Number 4, Unit 731. The Imperial Japanese Army's Unit 731 conducted some pretty horrible experiments during World War II that certainly are going to shock anyone who learns about them. This is wild. This definitely belongs on this list. The experiments were meant to be done as a way to prepare for biological warfare, but the process was horrible and extremely inhumane, as are most of these things. Different medical schools and universities all provided doctors and other research staff to help conduct these experiments. Big group effort, nice, way to go guys. They used both prisoners and civilians as test subjects. There were a bunch of different experiments that were conducted during this time, some of which involved injecting them with pathogens like cholera or anthrax, or operations with just no anesthesia, just weapon testing, all painful stuff, really the worst of the worst. Number 3, MK Ultra. We have to include a mind control project. Do you believe in mind control? Some claim they're born with it, like an X-Men, so if that's you, you know where to meet. MK Ultra, where do I start? Okay, it was originally a secret CIA project that lasted from 1953 to 1973, where they ran hundreds of experiments to US citizens. They gave them hallucinogens in an attempt to crack mind control, or sorry, as they called it, information gathering. Yeah, it's like what Apple says. Oh, we're just gathering information. Yeah, okay. In the 50s and 60s, around the Cold War, the United States believed that the Soviets, Chinese, and or North Korean agents were all using mind control in the war. That was their best explanation towards these brainwashed prisoners of war in Korea at the time. Yeah, it's gotta be brainwashing, nothing else, right? Horrible tests were being conducted in universities, hospitals, and again, in prisons. The happenings of these projects weren't fully known to the public until years after it ended. It was a huge, horrible secret. The agency destroyed most MK documents back in 1973 when it officially ended, so we think we know, when in reality we probably know little to nothing what actually occurred. Number 2, the Stanford Prison Experiment. Perhaps the most famous psychological experiment gone wrong. The Stanford Prison Experiment. Let's talk about it. It started August 14th, 1971. It was led by university psychology professor Philip Zimbardo. Again, another university study. My gosh. I mean, to be fair, Hogwarts was also messed up, but Hogwarts wasn't real now, was it? The Stanford Prison Experiment was very real. The experiment took volunteers and divided them into 2 groups. One group of prisoners and one group of guards. And they placed all these volunteers into a fake prison that was created for the experiment, okay? The experiment aimed to see if and how quickly humans would turn evil, under the right conditions of course, with the right amount of power. Yeah, pretty twisted, right? It's basically a group version of the Milgram experiment. It was a test to try and answer the question of if humans are inherently good or inherently evil. And after just 6 days, we found out. Yeah, 6 days later, the experiment needed to be concluded because the guards began absolutely tormenting the prisoners in the worst ways possible. It really showed the kinds of things humans can be capable of, even after just a short amount of time, less than a week. And humans are like, oh, I'll be evil. And finally, coming in number 1, facial expressions experiment. Yep, a wild one to close her off. The facial expressions experiment. Okay, back in 1924, a psychologist with, you guessed it, the University of Minnesota, classic university stuff, he wanted to conduct an experiment to study facial expressions, right? Sounds pretty harmless so far, dare I say, sounds a little silly. More specifically, he wanted to see if everyone's expressions of emotions were all the exact same. Does happiness look the same on everybody? Does sadness? What about fear or shock, disgust, anger? What about those? So he recruited some volunteers from campus and then painted the lines of their facial muscles black. And then he exposed each participant to different stimuli in order to photograph their reactions. He wanted to compare all these results side by side. The stimuli at hand was intense. This guy wanted big reactions. He included showing them adult films, he exposed them to ammonia, he made them touch reptiles, and of course horrible things that I can't talk about here on the tube of you. You know what I mean? Horrible, horrible stuff. All in the name of facial expressions. What an awful experiment. What a dark one.
In our number 10 spot, we have the hepatitis outbreak. Allegedly, in the 50s, there was a New York state-run institution for mentally handicapped young ones called Willowbrook State School, and it unfortunately was known for its uncleanliness, and as a result, the school had an outbreak of hepatitis. A doctor got wind of what was going on in that school, and he created an experiment that would assist in developing a vaccine. The only problem is the experiment would involve deliberately infecting the young ones with the disease. Horrible. His name was Dr. Sewell Krugman. The experiment received a lot of attention from the media, but the parents signed permission slips, so people let it go, unfortunately. However, apparently it was very hard to get into this school, so some think that parents felt that they had to sign these forms and allow it in order to keep their kid there. I can imagine that in the 50s there wasn't a lot of options, so that's truly sad, especially hearing that their only option was an extremely dirty school. In our number 9 spot, we have nuclear testing. In 1954, the US government started performing nuclear tests near the Marshall Islands in the Pacific Ocean. The US was performing a series of nuclear tests that they called Castle Bravo, and these tests unfortunately resulted in a yield larger than anticipated. This then led the government to create Project 4.1, where they decided to study how the humans, the Marshallese nearby, were affected by the explosion. Some believe that the explosion and its impact was all an accident, but some believe that the US government planned this so that they could study and see how these people would be affected. Many of the Marshallese people had radiation poisoning, and of course, as you can imagine, many developed cancer that is believed to be associated with the explosion. Beta burns were also seen after the incident. In our number 8 spot, we have electroshock therapy. Some of these experiments quite possibly could have been done by people that believe that they are doing some good, but they themselves are insane. Either that or they are evil, because to experiment on young ones in any way is truly sickening. Here we have a doctor in the 1960s named Dr. Loretta Bender, who worked at New York's Creedmoor Hospital, and she began a treatment that she believed to be a revolutionary treatment for kids with social issues. It was electroshock therapy. She would interview and analyze a young one in front of a large group of people, and she would apply pressure to their heads. Apparently, the people who would move were considered to have shown early signs of schizophrenia. It was said that she was not sympathetic to the young patients, and that in her time she used this electroshock therapy on over 100 young ones. It is unknown how these young ones were affected long term. In our number 7 spot, we have the stuttering experiment. Here we have yet another experiment that makes my blood boil. I'll get to why in a bit. This test took place in 1939 by Wendell Johnson and Mary Tudor, and the purpose of this test was to analyze the psychology around why people stutter and or how it can be cured. These researchers experimented on 22 young orphans and separated them into 2 groups. One group got praise for how they spoke, and the other group got negative feedback. The group that got negative feedback had normal speaking orphans suddenly begin to develop speech problems that apparently they had for the rest of their lives. I myself have struggled with speaking in my past, and that is why I actually started pushing myself to be in front of the camera and practice. So it's definitely hard to hear about experiments like this that could truly make or break the confidence of a young person. So gross. In our number 6 spot, we have the prison transplants. From 1913 to 1951, there was a surgeon doctor at California's San Quentin prison by the name of Dr. Leo Stanley, who obviously had access to many patients in the prison, and so he began to start testing on them. The experiments would range from sterilization to potential treatments for the Spanish flu to performing transplant surgeries. The transplant surgeries would actually be testicle transplants using testicles of executed prisoners and sometimes from animals like goats, for example. Yeah, that is truly horrific and definitely evil, and arguably he should have been in this prison. Isn't it weird how many horrible prison guard or prison doctor stories there are out there about them mistreating the inmates? Something that I'm sure a lot of prisoners were imprisoned for. Makes you think. In our number 5 spot, we have the Guatemalan test subjects. From 1946 to 1948, the US government, the president of Guatemala, and the health ministry in Guatemala were all in cahoots with each other, and they began performing experiments on Guatemalans without their consent. They were made to participate. Doctors deliberately infected people with syphilis and sexually transmitted diseases to track their untreated natural progression. Holy moly. When you think about it, that was after the war and only 76 years ago. It would be naive to think that this would never happen again. These patients were only given antibiotics to help. This resulted in 30 deaths, however, that is only what was documented. We don't actually know how many deaths actually occurred from this. It was only in 2010 that the US government made a formal apology for their involvement. In our number 4 spot, we have the Tuskegee experiment. This one is another experiment that is just simply so gross that it's hard to even talk about. In 1932, the US Public Health worked with the Tuskegee Institute to track the natural progression of untreated syphilis. 600 people from Alabama were experimented on and infected with syphilis, and of the group, 399 already had syphilis. None of them were told that they had a disease that was life-threatening. They were told that they would receive free health care for participating, free meals, and burial insurance. The study continued till 1972, long after a cure was found. Many passed away and got severely ill from this experiment. In 1997, the president at the time, Bill Clinton, apologized to those affected, and he called this the most infamous biomedical experiment in US history. That was said in 1997 though, so I'm sure there have been more famous worldwide biomedical experiments now that perhaps we, the public, are just not aware of yet. If it took 25 years to get a formal apology and for it to become public knowledge, then who knows what we might discover and get an apology for in the future. In our number 3 spot, we have the mosquito experiment. How more people don't know about these experiments is truly beyond me. This one is deeply shocking to hear, so brace yourself. In 1956 and 1957, the US Army, aka the government because it would have had to have been approved, conducted a series of experiments on Florida, Georgia, and Savannah where they released millions of infected mosquitoes in order to see if insects could spread yellow fever. Of course, they learned that yes, they can, as many people contracted fevers, serious respiratory problems, stillbirths, typhoid, and much more. Apparently, to take it another step further, in order to get photo evidence of the experiment, researchers acted as health workers so they could see the patients. Many died from this experiment, as you can imagine. I wonder if there are any long-term effects for the people in these areas. I guess that's info I'm sure we'll never know. It's probably kept in top secret places like Area 51, let's be real. In our number 2 spot, we have Korean experimentation. Allegedly, there have been a ton of North Korean experiments over the years on prisoners. One experiment that has been spoken about was one where 50 female prisoners, all of good health, were given poisoned cabbage leaves. Apparently, within the hour, all had died. Allegedly, they also do experimental surgeries without anesthesia, starve them, and at times gas entire families. It is rumored that there is a van called The Crow where people are taken every month for these experiments. I truly hope that this is something from the past, but I know that there will always be evil in the world as much as we all wish there wasn't, so I wouldn't be surprised to hear that this is possibly something that still happens, and I truly hope it isn't. In our number 1 spot, we have Navy volunteers. In 1943, young men who were in the Navy were basically tricked into volunteering themselves to be gassed. This happened in the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington in the US. They were told that this experiment might help shorten the war, and so of course they wanted to do their duty and help. They were exposed to mustard gas, which of course was a deadly gas that was actively used in World War I. They were only told what they were participating in once the experiment was about to start. All of the soldiers suffered severe external and internal burns. All of the people were allegedly silenced and threatened by the Navy, and it wasn't until the 90s, when the documents were declassified, was this experiment taken to Congress.
Number 10. The Stanford Prison Experiment. We're starting with one of the more arguably famous examples on the list, though the references to it as a successful experiment might be pushing it. In the summer of 1971, a professor of psychology by the name of Philip Zimbardo would lead a study at Stanford University. The idea was to create a prison environment in which participants would be placed in different roles as either prisoners or guards. Paid $15 an hour, which is roughly equivalent to 110 United States dollars today, participants were set to live within this brutal environment for a period of 2 weeks. But the experiment ended up only lasting 5. You'll see why soon. The idea was that the experiment would allow professors to study the difference in the balance of power within prisons, as well as learn about antisocial behavior, a note which even led the US Navy to fund the experiment. Over the course of 5 days, prisoners were tortured by the guards, each guard becoming drastically more cruel and vile to their charges. They were psychologically manipulated and abused, given arbitrary tasks and regulations which included management of when they could use the bathroom and where. Humiliation was regular, and by the 3rd day, several prisoners underwent a few breakdowns and were released. On the 5th day of the experiment, Professor Christina Maslach would visit the experiment and immediately demand it cease. The next day, Zimbardo did halt the experiment and offered to pay all participants their full wages. It would later be revealed that the guards only acted in the ways they did under Zimbardo's instruction, which led to the impossibility of the experiment's reproduction and an immediate nationwide review of the ethics in experimentation. Number 9. The Neubauer separations. Peter Neubauer was a child psychiatrist who immigrated to the US in 1941 from Austria. Initially taking work for the Bellevue Hospital in New York, Neubauer began to work on one of the most vile experiments in his entire career. Attempting to study the differences in twins and triplets, Neubauer oversaw the separation of multiple groups of twins and one set of triplets, overseeing their growth and development into adults. Neubauer never revealed to the twins nor their adoptive parents that they had siblings, and when the twins did learn of this, there was outrage. Numerous biographical stories have been published on this. Several twins also unfortunately took their own lives, and the findings of the study have been sealed by Neubauer within Yale University until 2065. Number 8. Project 4.1. In March 1st, 1954, the Marshall Island region known as Bikini Atoll was subjected to nuclear weapons tests led by the United States government and dubbed Castle Bravo. As a result, fallout was carried eastwards, contaminating 23 members of a Japanese fishing vessel and the entire populations of the Rongelap and Utrecht atolls. Instead of taking responsibility, the government organized Project 4.1 with the intent of studying the Marshallese victims. Ultimately, 239 Marshallese people were exposed, as well as 28 Americans who were stationed on one of the atolls. Effects included loss of hair, skin damage, lesions, and extreme development of cancer, as well as miscarriages and stillbirths. The US government has never attempted to give compensation for these actions. Number 7. Burke and Hare. 19th and 20th century medical history has had a long and troubled history. As scientists have attempted to better understand the human body, a number of them have taken extreme measures to obtain subjects. One of the more notorious of these involved William Burke and William Hare, two men working out of Edinburgh, Scotland. During a decline in legally supplied cadavers, Hare was lodging a friend who suddenly passed away. Turning to his friend Burke, the two decided to sell the corpse to Robert Knox. As more people lodged at the Hare's house, the two men took the life of a sick woman and sold the body to Knox. They continued their spree until the discovery of Margaret Docherty, their final victim. The two were found guilty and executed, and Knox was exonerated of charges, though whether or not he actually knew how the bodies were retrieved remains an open question. Number 6. Project MK Ultra. Another infamous experiment, MK Ultra began with the intention of developing new drugs for the CIA to use in interrogations. The method in which these experiments were carried out was disgusting, with over 7,000 non-consenting civilians from the US and Canada unknowingly made to participate. Psychoactive drugs were secretly administered to them, as well as the use of electroshock therapy, hypnosis, isolation, and a lot of other forms of abuse and torture that are not great. Anyways, running from 1950 to 1970, it wouldn't be until 1975 when these experiments were brought to light by Frank Church. But as the documents were destroyed by a knee-jerk response to the Watergate scandal in 1973, most of the evidence is largely testimonial. However, in 2001, a large number of documents were discovered and declassified. Number 5. The Monster Study. Another disgusting experiment. The Monster Study was headed by Wendell Johnson, a speech pathologist working out of the University of Iowa. Johnson's experiment was performed on 22 orphans with the goal of inducing stuttering within the subjects. Effectively, half of the orphans were given positive encouragement during their speech therapy, while the other half were mocked for their speech even if they didn't stutter to begin with. The staff would lie and pretend that the orphans were showing signs of potentially stuttering. The results? Well, it didn't induce stuttering as Johnson had hoped, and most of the subjects became withdrawn and extremely defensive. Who'da thunk it? Number 4. The Aversion Project. A program developed by Dr. Aubrey Levin in South Africa. The intent of this experiment was to attempt to cure soldiers of their homosexuality. I want to let that one sit for a little bit, let it simmer in your brain. As being gay was banned in the South African military, Levin was free to do as he pleased to his victims, which included chemical castration and compulsion electroshock therapy. There were a grand total of 900 victims of these experiments. Levin got 5 years in prison. I really don't want to talk about this anymore. Number 3. The Tuskegee Study. Conducted between 1932 and 1972, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study was a racially motivated experiment which used black people exclusively as subjects. Attempting to study syphilis and its effects, a total of 600 men were studied, with 399 being infected with the disease. These men were informed that the experiment would only take 6 months, treated with a number of toxic solutions including arsenic and mercury, and then were administered placebos. It was then extended to 40 years, with the victims never knowing that the disease was one they could spread. Not to mention that they never even knew why the experiment was being done in the first place. These men continued to be subjected to even more drugs and spinal taps, but hey, in 1947 they figured out that penicillin was actually a pretty solid drug that worked on syphilis. So anyways, they just kind of kept going until Peter Buxton blew the whistle on the operation. In the end, most of the subjects died as a result of the experiment, and several legal cases led to a number of settlements from the government, the most famous being Pollard versus the United States. Number 2. The Guatemala Syphilis Study. So nice, they did it twice. Wow, it's almost like there's a trend here or something. Perpetrated by John Charles Cutler, also worked on the Tuskegee Study. This study was initially meant to be inflicted on an Indiana-based prison, but instead moved to Guatemala. Why? Well, it isn't officially stated, but I think we can all probably guess. Subjects were exposed to syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroids, with over 5,000 people having participated and 83 passing away during the experiment. And of course, the US government has never compensated its victims. Number 1. Unit 731. The horrors inflicted by the Imperial Japanese Army were many, but none so great as the ones inflicted by Unit 731. When the complex was built in Pingfang, the initial intent was to build biological weapons, and their test subjects were Chinese civilians, trained to view their victims as non-human and told to refer to them as logs. The experiments that were carried out by 731 led to the deaths of between 200 and 300,000 individuals individuals. Some of the experiments included vivisection, poisoning, weapons testing, frostbite testing, syphilis testing, and also some of the literal worst things I have ever had to read about. The Japanese government has not taken responsibility for this alongside their other numerous war crimes committed during the Second World War, and when victims have asked for compensation, they have been refused on the grounds that their needs were met by international peace treaties.
Alright, starting off at number 10 now, we have the twin studies. Joseph Mengele was the chief medical officer at Auschwitz concentration camp during the Holocaust. Far from being a doctor to the people there, he used them as part of his sort of twisted medical studies. Mengele had an obsession with twins. From 1943 to 1944, he performed experiments on almost 1,500 sets of in-prison twins. Just 200 of them survived. One study involved injecting different dyes into the eyes of twins to see whether it would change their eye color. Another involved sewing twins together in some sort of sick attempt to create conjoined twins. Some of the other studies are far too graphic to even talk about in this video. Next up at number 9 now, we have the poison labs. This is the name given to the Soviet Union's secret testing labs for poisons. During the 1950s, the researchers there would test deadly poisons on prisoners who came from the gulags. That translates to enemies of the people. These poisons included mustard gas, ricin, digitoxin, curare, cyanide, and many others. All of them are deadly to humans and many of them are very painful. The goal of these studies was to find a tasteless, odorless chemical that could not be detected after death. In a final sick twist to this story, the prisoners were told that the poison was actually medicine for them. Insane. Next up at number 8 now, we have the Stanford prison experiment. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo led a research team to study human behavior when it came to authority and inmates in a prison setting. He set up a mock prison and got 24 volunteers to take part in it. They were assigned as either prisoners or the guards watching over them. Everything was designed to look and feel like a real prison, from the uniforms to the cells and even the ID numbers. The guards started to get way more involved in their roles than the researchers thought they would, verbally and then physically abusing their prisoners. By just the second day, the prisoners had already started to rebel. The guards put it down with brutal violence against them. The prisoners began to get emotionally traumatized, and on the 6th day, the experiment was ended 8 days early. Moving on to number 7 now, we have the Aversion Project. This experiment was a medical torture program in South Africa conducted by Dr. Aubrey Levin during the 1970s and 1980s. It was the military's attempt to root out homosexuality from the army, as it was seen back then as a mental illness. Over the years, 900 gay servicemen and some women were sent to the infamous Ward 22 for sexual reassignment surgeries, some of them as young as 16 years old. These surgeries involved chemical castration and electric shock treatment. The surgery attempted to change the men into physical females. Apart from these surgeries being horrifically unethical, they were also botched quite often, leaving the victims cast out into the world without the hormones needed to maintain their new identities. Coming at number 6 now, we have Project 4.1. This was a US medical study of people living on the Marshall Islands who were exposed to radiation from a nearby nuclear bomb test in 1954. The study effectively saw them as guinea pigs in a radiation experiment. Many people accused the US government of having their primary goal as studying the people and not actually helping them. The poor residents of the Marshall Islands suffered miscarriages, stillbirths, developmental difficulties, and impaired growth. The government knew the American public would not react kindly to news of this experiment and ordered everyone involved to keep it a secret. But as you can tell, secrets always get out. Next up at number 5 now, we have the Monster Study. With a name like that, you know it's not going to be good. This study took place at the University of Iowa in 1939 by Wendell Johnson. They took 22 orphan children and split them into 2 separate groups. One group was given positive speech therapy. That means they were praised and encouraged as they became more fluent in English. The other half got the exact opposite. They were belittled, even bullied every single time they made a mistake. This had a serious negative effect on the children. Some of them even stopped speaking altogether. Their mental health and academic studies suffered greatly. The university tried to sweep all of this under the rug, but eventually the details came out. They were criticized heavily for damaging vulnerable orphan children, maybe permanently, just to prove a theory. The university issued a public apology in 2001. At the number 4 spot now, we have the Willowbrook State School. This was a school in New York for people with mental disabilities. Starting from the late 1950s, medical researchers noticed there were large hepatitis outbreaks there. They studied studied it to gain a better understanding of the illness. However, the researchers seemed to cross a line when they began feeding live hepatitis viruses to 60 healthy children in order to study them. They watched their skin and eyes turn yellow, their livers got bigger, and they began to vomit and even refuse to eat. The researchers justified all of this by saying, well, they were going to get hepatitis anyway, but history has definitely condemned them. Moving on to number 3 now, we have the Tuskegee experiment. This clinical study by the US Public Health Service took place for an astounding 40 years, beginning in 1932. It involved offering 399 poor black males who had syphilis a treatment. However, the researchers withheld the treatment as their real aim was to just study the progress of syphilis on humans. In 1947, penicillin became available as a treatment. Some of the victims began to look elsewhere for help, but the researchers told them not to and continued to lie about their true condition. When the study finally ended in 1972, just 74 of the 399 test subjects were still alive. 28 of them had died of syphilis, 100 from other complications. 40 of their wives had also been infected, and 19 of their children were born with congenital syphilis. As part of a class action lawsuit, the US government paid $9 million to the surviving participants and their descendants. For many people though, the pain can never be healed with money. Next up at number 2 now, we have mustard gas. In 1943, the US Navy exposed its own sailors to mustard gas in order to test the effectiveness of their new protective clothing for it. They wanted to see how it stood up in a real life situation and not just in a lab. Perhaps the most infamous of these experiments involved 17 and 18-year-old males still in boot camp who were asked if they wanted to take part in an experiment that would shorten the war. Of course, many of them said yes, but it wasn't until they reached a lab that they were told it would involve mustard gas. Some of them left at this point, but many of them didn't. Most of the participants suffered extreme external and internal burns. They were largely ignored by the Navy after that because they didn't want to draw attention to this awful experiment. And finally, at number 1 now, we have Unit 731. This was the secret chemical warfare research unit of Japan during World War II. They wanted to study the human body in perverse ways and mainly did so on Allied prisoners of war as well as Chinese civilians. Experiments included limb amputation to study the effects of blood loss, and sometimes they would even try and reattach amputated limbs to the other side of the body just to see what would happen. One other famous experiment there involved freezing all of the subject's limbs and then amputating them one by one until only the victim's head and torso remained. This is only really scratching the surface into the horrors that Unit 731 brought upon its many victims. Starting off at number 10 now, we have the Manhattan Project. Some of you guys may recognize the name of this one. It was the secret name for America's project to produce the atomic bombs that brought World War II to an end. Harry Daghlian was a young physicist who worked on the project. During an experiment on August 21st, 1945, he was attempting to build a neutron reflector manually by stacking a set of 4.4 kilogram tungsten carbide bricks in an incremental fashion around a plutonium core. Unfortunately, he dropped a brick which set off a chain reaction. He tried to stop the reaction, but by the time it was over, he received a high dose of neutron radiation. Harry received intense medical care for severe radiation poisoning. His mother and sister even flew out to New Mexico to care for him, but Harry fell into a coma. He died 25 days after the accident. His death resulted in new safety regulations when handling radioactive material. Next up at number 9 now, we have the dioxin tests. In 1965, dermatologist Dr. Albert Kligman conducted a study on behalf of the US Army and some pharmaceutical companies. They wanted to know how human skin reacts to harsh chemicals, a process known as hardening. Most of the information about these tests has since been destroyed or just covered up. We do know that he described his patients as acres of skin to experiment on. We also know he used dioxin on them, the active ingredient in Agent Orange. This happened around the time the US was covering Vietnam with Agent Orange in an attempt to push the fight against the Viet Cong in their favor. To speed up the experiments, Dr. Kligman injected his victims with a reported 468 times the recommended safe dose of dioxin. After that, not much more has been uncovered. It's thought there are still about 70 of the patients out there still. Their identities and current condition unknown. Next up at number 8 now, we have Operation Sea Spray. In September 1950, the US Navy spent 6 days spreading the bacterium Surretia marcescens into the air about 2 miles off the coast of California. That bacterium lives in soil and water and is best known for its ability to produce a bright red pigment. This trait makes it useful in experiments because it's so bright, it's very easy to see where it is. The project was called Operation Sea Spray. Its aim was to determine the susceptibility of a big city like San Francisco to a bioweapon attack by terrorists. In the following days, the military took samples of 43 sites to track the bacteria's spread. They found that it had infested the whole city and all the surrounding suburbs as well. During a test, residents of San Francisco inhaled millions of bacterial spores. The military deemed the experiment a success. They got to see how far chemical warfare could spread, and anyway, they knew the bacterium wasn't harmful, or so they thought. People started getting urinary tract infections, and it was even linked to the death of a patient recovering from prostate surgery. This experiment wasn't even public knowledge until 1976, a full 26 years after the event. Moving on to number 7 now, we have Project MK Ultra. This is a particularly famous one that you guys may have heard me talk about in a previous video. During the 1950s and 60s, at the height of the Cold War, the US feared that communist countries were using mind control techniques to brainwash US prisoners of war in Korea. They wanted in on the action. So in response, the CIA authorized Project MK Ultra in 1953. The secret operation was aimed at developing a defense against drugs or other manipulators that could control human behavior. Such was the secrecy of this project that even today, not much is known about it. But we do know this: the project involved more than 150 human experiments involving psychedelic drugs, paralytics, and electroshock therapy. Sometimes the test subjects were aware they were participating in a study, but shockingly, many did not, even when the hallucinogenic effects started kicking in. Can you even imagine how scary that would be? Many of the tests took place at universities, hospitals, or prisons in the US and Canada between 1953 and 1964. The CIA didn't keep many records though, and any good ones were destroyed when the program came to an official end in 1973. Moving on to number 6 now, we have North Korea. Some of the things we've all heard about North Korea may not be true, but some of them may be even worse than we could ever imagine. In 2014, a former North Korean officer stepped forward to say that the nation's military were using mentally and physically disabled children as test subjects in chemical experiments. He said this was the last straw that caused him to defect and leave the country. The man was called Im Cheon-young, and he said he was taken to special training at the military academy. It was there where they taught him how to confuse the enemy without revealing your own forces, how to carry out assassinations, and how to use chemical weapons. He was close to defecting on this alone, and then came the field learning. This involved testing biological and chemical weapons on so-called objects. At first, these objects were mice, but soon they were using humans. Im said that he saw with his very own eyes disabled people, sometimes children, being killed by these chemical weapons just to show the soldiers how they worked. One expert said this is not surprising. Anyone who visits the capital will never see disabled people because they are allegedly taken away as children and incarcerated in special camps. Perhaps these evil experiments are what the camps are all leading up to. Moving on to number 5 now, we have Project QKHILLTOP. This was a CIA project developed to study Chinese brainwashing techniques, which they used to develop new methods of interrogation. The research was led by a man named Dr. Howard Wolf. Now, he was a researcher at Cornell University's medical school. Dr. Wolf requested the CIA provide him with information on imprisonment, deprivation, humiliation, torture, brainwashing, hypnosis, and more. Based on this, the team began to formulate a plan. They wanted to develop secret drugs and various brain-damaging procedures. According to a letter that he wrote, in order to fully test the effects of this, Wolf wanted the CIA to make available suitable subjects. Once they had provided these poor souls to test on, Wolf also detailed the next step his research team would take. They would then assemble, collate, analyze, and assimilate the information, and will then undertake experimental investigations designed to develop new techniques of offensive, defensive intelligence using a potentially useful secret drug. Basically, the whole thing is just the stuff of nightmares. I have no idea how this got through. Nothing more is really known about the test subjects, or victims as they are often referred to now. Moving up to number 4 now, we have Dr. Loretta Bender. This doctor has gone down in history for her experiments on children. She was a child psychiatrist who specialized in children believed to have schizophrenia. For almost 3 decades, from 1942 to 1969, she was a highly respected expert in her field. Her preferred choice of treatment was electroshock therapy. These days, the practice has been banned in most of the world as it's seen as ineffective, cruel, and borderline torture in some cases. Still, this was a different time, and that's what Dr. Bender did to the children. Her methods involved interviewing and analyzing a sensitive child in front of a large group of people. She would then apply a gentle amount of pressure to the child's head. The theory was any child who moved with the pressure was showing early signs of schizophrenia. These days, that's referred to as total pseudoscience, but it took a while to figure that out. By the time her treatments were shut down, Bender had used electroshock therapy on over 100 children, the youngest of whom was just age 3. Reports described her as uncaring and the study as unethical. The shocks can cause memory loss, nausea, headaches, jaw pain, or even serious heart trouble, even in kids. Some say all of this was a result of Bender's misunderstood childhood that she had, and she was the product of her own environment and family. Now that is proper psychology, I'm just saying. Moving on to number 3 now, we have the Burke and Hare murders. William Burke is a guy who has probably tainted my surname forever. Along with William Hare, these two men from Northern Ireland were famous grave robbers in Scotland. One day, an old man they knew died, and to cover his outstanding debt to them, they decided to sell his body for medical science. Edinburgh University gave them £7 and 10 shillings, a handsome sum in those days. With that, they were hooked. When another associate they knew fell ill, they couldn't even wait to see if he would die, and so they suffocated him in his bed. Again, they sold his body to the university for money. The killing spree began. The pair murdered and sold bodies almost as their full-time jobs. They killed an old grandmother with an overdose of painkillers. Hare even killed his own blind grandson by breaking his back across his knee. Eventually though, their whole operation was discovered when they got too sloppy. William Burke was hanged in front of a cheering crowd of over 25,000 people. Fittingly, after being put on public display, his body was donated to medical science. Next up at number 2 now, we have J. Marion Sims. This doctor was once praised as the father of modern gynecology. Now his reputation has been tarnished forever. It was found that he practiced these surgical techniques that made him famous on enslaved women. They included Lucy, Anarcha, and Betsy. The rest of them are unknown. He performed 30 surgeries on Anarcha alone, all without anesthesia. His legacy has long been questioned for the disturbing ethical questions that it raises, especially by those who believe that he used black women as medical guinea pigs without their consent. The Black Youth Project 100, a group of activists aged between 18 and 35, staged protests at a statue of Sims in New York. They wore hospital gowns splashed with red paint dripping down their legs. In a Facebook post, they explained that Sims had purchased black women slaves and used them as guinea pigs for his untested surgical experiments. He repeatedly performed genital surgery on black women without anesthesia because, according to him, black women don't feel pain. Despite his very inhumane tests on black women, Sims was named the father of modern gynecology, and his statue currently stands right outside the New York Academy of Medicine. And finally, number 1 now, we have the pregnant women. In January 2018, it emerged that after the Second World War, the US military gave nearly 1,000 pregnant women radioactive iron by their doctors without their knowledge. This was all part of a series of experiments to test the effects. Between 1945 and 1947, researchers at Vanderbilt University conducted this sick experiment that was funded by the US Public Health Service. All of the women were poor and had no knowledge of the experiment whatsoever. Afterwards, they were not even informed that they had been part of the study either. The radioactive iron was given as part of a medical cocktail by health officials that they trusted. Their aim was to record the absorption of iron during pregnancy. However, in the years since then, investigators have said this too was a lie, and that the real reason was for the military to learn more about radiation exposure. In the 1990s, Vanderbilt University finally acknowledged and investigated the experiments. The story broke when 2 women and one of their daughters filed a lawsuit against the university for exposing them to radiation. One of the women was Emma Kraft. She said at a Senate hearing that the experiments caused the death of her 11-year-old daughter due to cancer. The true effects of this study are still being investigated today.